AP Comparative. This is Andrew Canine from the suburbs of Chicago, broadcasting straight from Studio Room 2C, where there's always room to see how countries compare. An incredible topic today, super timely, with international news about COVID-19. Today is 2 for Tuesday, topics 1.8 and 1.9, both topics discussing political legitimacy, building political legitimacy, and also sustaining political legitimacy in all countries, but really specific to our 6 core countries in AP comparative government. Thank you for tuning in this Tuesday. Thank you for your dedication to prepping for the AP comparative exam. We do have a test date. That is my name. First of all, if you have not gotten this message, make sure you download the materials that I'm basing these codes off of, the AP comparative course description. You can get that off of collegeboard.org in your student account. There is a link to the full PDF address, and you can get fuller notes that I'm using for my slides at citizenu.org. Make sure you go into Comparative Corner. You can also peruse all those other materials Mr. Larson's put together for APUS if you've also signed up for that exam. Our date, as I was saying before, is May 22nd at noon Eastern Time. And we do have 2 FRQs that are going to be the modified argument essay and the modified quantitative analysis. You can get more information at that website. As we talk about legitimacy, talk about political legitimacy, here are our 3 teacher shout outs for today. If you would like to shout out to that teacher who has helped get you ready, who has really prepped you by teaching you the ins and outs up until the middle of March about comparative government, please use that Twitter hashtag APCompGov2020. Give your teacher a shout out. Give us the name of your school. Give us your location. We'd like to know who our audience is. Not the biggest audience in AP world, but I'm going to tell you, the best audience in AP world and the best teachers, including Mrs. Wickert. I know Mrs. Wickert then at Naperville Central, and Mrs. Wigand at Naperville North. That would be interesting comparative. Let's do a comparative lesson on Naperville Central versus Naperville North. I bet we can get some juicy information there. And really excited about this shout out from Yuchen, all the way out in Queens. Very hard hit area of the country with COVID-19. So we're super excited that Yuchen has reached out to us. Yuchen is from Benjamin Cardozo High School, one of the more interesting figures in American judicial history, former Supreme Court Justice Benjamin Cardozo. And his comparative teacher, is Mrs. Sucheka at Benjamin Cardozo High School. So thank you to all those students who have tweeted out shout outs for their teachers. Keep those coming. And actually, by the end of today's broadcast, I'd really like your suggestions on building an FRQ for tomorrow. I'm going to get to that a little bit more, but I need your suggestions. Let's create an FRQ together using social media. But feel free to tweet out country examples of the topics that I'm going over. Yesterday was 1.7. We were looking at the difference between the division of powers between federal countries and unitary countries. Got some really interesting examples at the Twitter hashtag, including, he's back. Alex Dewey Benrox is back with a terrific example of the United Kingdom being a federal government, the United Kingdom being a unitary government with the power concentrated in the central government, but that did not prevent the central government from devolving powers specifically to Northern Ireland with what's known as the Good Friday Peace Agreement. And I mentioned on Twitter to Alex Dewey Benrox that that actually comes up in a later topic when we talk about how governments treat different social cleavages. We'll look at that more. If you don't know about the Good Friday Peace Agreement, I'll go into that a little bit more into Unit 3. But that's a good example of devolution from the United Kingdom. I also asked at the end of the broadcast yesterday, what are some country-specific examples of building and sustaining political legitimacy? That's our topic today, political legitimacy. Spoiler alerts, political legitimacy is the belief by citizens in their government's power to rule. It's kind of a psychological element to government. It's legitimate. Is your government legitimate? If the people believe the government has the right to rule, that's legitimacy. We can see legitimacy in both democratic and authoritarian governments. So I asked for some country-specific examples. It did not take long. Chris G got on. We got our first example of President Putin from Russia. And of course, it was a really interesting picture of President Putin. And Chris G was making the argument at hashtag APCompGov 2020 that this particular picture of Putin on horseback was meant to project this image of strength to increase the political legitimacy of Russia's national government, and particularly the legitimacy of Putin's presidency. Of course, copyright violation prohibits me from putting those pictures or any memes related to those Putin pictures on this PowerPoint, but feel free to share your other pictures of Putin. I hear there's a few of them out there on the internet machine. Feel free to tweet other pictures of Putin that you think might build legitimacy of Putin or Russia's national government, or any other images, political images, particularly of heads of state from our 6 core countries that build and sustain political legitimacy. I suppose there are also images of core leaders from our core countries that might be perceived to weaken political legitimacy, particularly pictures of more leaders from our more authoritarian governments. But let's see what you come up with at hashtag APCompGov 2020. And I promised Mrs. Canine a shout out. Mrs. Canine never took comparative government. But she did watch the entire series of The Crown. And I have to tell you, she asked me to give her credit that the other night when the Queen came on, the head of state of the United Kingdom, giving her address, and we referenced this yesterday in the Queen's speech about UK's response to COVID-19, Mrs. Canine, my spouse, said she predicted that something was wrong with Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister. And I said, why would you say that? And she said, I feel like I've seen this in an episode of The Crown. Now, The Crown never got anywhere close to modern day British politics, but it certainly focuses on the head of state reign of Queen Elizabeth II. And sure enough, yesterday we did see the news that Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, was admitted to the ICU with his case of coronavirus. So Mrs. Canine claims that the Queen's speech was giving legitimacy, I suppose, to the British government, despite the health crisis that has even affected their head of government, Boris Johnson. Today, we are looking at political legitimacy. We are focused on topics 1.8 and 1.9, 2 for Tuesday. And we're going to be looking at political legitimacy in all 6 core countries. We'll later connect this with Unit 2. We're just a couple of days away from starting Unit 2 when we look more at the institutions of government. And particularly, we'll see legitimacy come up when it comes to the constraint of legislative powers in topic 2.7. We are, again, making our way through Unit 1. Tomorrow will be our last lesson on Unit 1. We'll do one more review as we get closer to our deadline date at the end of these broadcasts. But tomorrow we're doing topic 1.10, and then we'll move into Unit 2 sequentially through key units to help get you ready. And as you know, if you've watched before, lots of practice questions, both multiple choice, and I try to do an FRQ, potential FRQ, hypothetical FRQ every day. So what you need to know about topic 1.8 and 1.9, what you need to know is critical vocabulary. And the vocabulary that's listed in the course description, again, you don't need to rely on inference or implication. College Board has given us a specific list of critical vocabulary in the essential knowledge points, and we can see that legitimacy and sources of legitimacy are 2 of those words. We'll get into more definitions and examples of those, and we're bringing up that word devolution again. Here's where, if you read the course description, you're going to see that word devolution as it applies to the United Kingdom. And here's where the AP course description gives us that hint that there's a connection between that word that we relate to the United Kingdom, devolution of giving powers to regional governments, and that connects in with our concept of today, political legitimacy. You can see where those concepts overlap. So anything with an asterisk, comes straight from the course description, and I have just cut and paste that to give you an idea of how valuable of a resource that can be to understand these words. So legitimacy, as I said before, my definition, it's a psychological element that is the people's belief in the government's right to rule. The definition we have here refers to whether a government's constituents believe that their government has the right to use power in the way they do. Legitimacy confers authority and can increase the power of a regime and a government. Sources of legitimacy, it can overlap both between democratic and authoritarian regimes, and it could include elections, popular elections. It can include constitutional elements, the protection of civil liberties. History can be a huge part of political legitimacy. Nationalism, which is evident in all 6 of our core countries, can definitely provide political legitimacy. Tradition, how effective is the government? Economic growth can be critical. Religion can also be used as a source of political legitimacy. And I should note, and we'll maybe say some examples, and you can tweet these out as well, when there's a crisis that not just our own country, the United States, is tackling, but countries and governments throughout the world, like COVID-19, the healthcare crisis, but also economic crisis as well. This can be a big challenge to political legitimacy, particularly when a government, whether it be a national government or a regional or a municipal government, is struggling to come to grips with the crisis, both in a healthcare way or economic way. And so particularly following the news is a really interesting way to keep track of, all right, what does this mean with legitimacy when it comes to how countries are tackling this? Like I mentioned before, the Queen's speech could certainly be seen as a way to try to build legitimacy in a time of chaos with some elements of the crisis. Let's see here. So I have put together this chart with a super brief description of a source of legitimacy for our 6 core countries, enormously brief. And I know this is an area when your teacher is teaching you the 6 different countries, this is an area where you can go into the political history of each of the countries and the really robust and interesting histories that each of these 6 countries have, to see where do the sources of legitimacy for the current regimes, for the current governments come from. And so certainly when you look at China, a lot of that legitimacy is traced back to the Communist Revolution of 1949, led by Mao Zedong, the first leader. And that certainly has not gone away. And some of the images that you see from China, from Tiananmen Square, are still those images of Chairman Mao. But we also know in more recent decades, the government also relies on this enormous economic growth. Economic growth that might be declining, but still China has the 2nd largest GDP in the world, and that consistent economic growth over the last 4 decades is a source of political legitimacy for the Communist Party. Iran, also a revolution in 1979, a religious revolution where the creation of the Islamic Republic occurred. And so their ability to trace back the government and the constitution and the key political leaders being religious leaders, tracing that back to Shia Islam and upholding the principles of Shia Islam is an enormous part of Iran's political legitimacy. Mexico also. Mexico, if you're learning about Mexican government and civics in Mexico and Mexican political history, Mexico takes credit for being the first social revolution of the 20th century, before Russia's revolution, before China's revolution. And so Mexico takes a great deal of pride in the role of their revolution and the creation of the Constitution. It's one of the world's longest lasting, consistent constitutions that was ratified in 1917. So that certainly becomes a source of legitimacy. And all these countries have constitutions that they could go back to, except of course, the United Kingdom, skipping ahead, that relies certainly on laws and laws that were passed, but also traditions. Traditions that go back hundreds of years, for instance, with the development of British law and common law, and the expansion of elections that comes both from tradition and from law. And certainly the British adage of keep calm and carry on, that idea of stability, bringing legitimacy to the government of the United Kingdom. With Russia, again, you have tremendous traditions that predate Russia's constitution from the early 1990s. And all these countries have elements of nationalism. What's really interesting when you get in the histories of all 6 of our countries, there's enormous pride in all 6 of the countries when it comes to political advances, economic advances, advances in civilization. And Russia is certainly no exception there. So there's tremendous pride in Russian nationalism. That certainly we know that President Putin has played up on during his almost 20 years of his presidency, minus those 4 years as prime minister. And of course, Nigeria also very proud of their role in the development of Africa, the diaspora of Nigerians across the world who contribute politically and economically across the globe, but also a lot of pride and independence from British colonialism, and that constitution, which after periods of political tumult, this is the longest lasting constitution that Nigeria has had that was ratified in 1999. So those are all sources of legitimacy in our core countries. So governments maintain legitimacy through a variety of processes or factors: policy effectiveness, political efficacy, traditions, charismatic leadership. Particularly when we look at charismatic leadership, one of the leaders who stands out would be President Putin. He's often connected with that term, charismatic leadership, and also laws that have been institutionalized, laws that have become part of the fabric of the different countries. Legitimacy can be reinforced or bolstered by peaceful resolution of conflicts or a peaceful transfer of power, reduced governmental corruption, and economic development. So I mentioned before, China and economic development is a key part of reinforcing the legitimacy of China's Communist Party. The peaceful resolution of the conflict in Northern Ireland can reinforce political legitimacy in the United Kingdom. We're going to see in a moment the peaceful transfer of power that we've seen in Mexico and Nigeria between rival political parties can reinforce political legitimacy, even amidst some political instability. So, and again, I mentioned before the charismatic leadership of Vladimir Putin, with the emphasis on Russian nationalism, can be an element that reinforces legitimacy. And increasing corruption, and corruption is a particular problem in all of the countries, but particularly 5 of the core countries, as you'll see in some of the data. Corruption is one of the key elements that can very quickly erode or undermine legitimacy. It can really challenge legitimacy, particularly when it's combined with conflicts and poor economic growth. So some examples of legitimacy that has been undermined or eroded. An example would be in both Iran and Russia, you've had significant protests against election fraud or perceived election fraud in the last 10, 11 years. So Iran's election from 2009, which many citizens of Iran thought was fraudulent, there were massive protests called the Green Revolution, and the government really cracked down with violence and oppression in Iran. Russia also had significant protests against perceived corruptions in their legislative and their presidential elections in 2011 and 2012. That also was met with other authoritarian measures I'll describe in a moment. With Nigeria, you cannot escape the wave of terrorist violence related to Boko Haram, that Islamist separatist group in northern Nigeria. And because of the violence, it really led to the defeat of the first time an incumbent president has been defeated in an election in Nigeria, when Goodluck Jonathan lost his presidential reelection in 2015. That certainly relates to the undermining of political legitimacy. Historical example I use in my class with Mexico goes back to natural disasters. How countries tackle disasters is a key part of legitimacy and can very much shape the political history of our country. So we're probably going to see that throughout the world with COVID-19. What will be the political impacts of COVID-19? It's one of the reasons that I know we have some teachers, Mr. Waxler's tweeting out articles talking about how governments have responded with authoritarian measures of surveillance around the world, especially in Russia and in China, as a response to COVID-19. In Mexico City, the massive natural disaster happened in the mid-1980s when a massive earthquake hit Mexico City, and the government was really feeble in how they responded to that natural disaster. And you'll see, I have examples of this in Unit 3. You saw the development of civil society groups and independent networks of citizens in Mexico City who teamed up to try to address the inadequate response by the government. And these civil society groups really led to political reforms and the development of political opposition to the pre-party. So that can be an example of how undermining legitimacy can really change the trajectory of politics in our core countries. President Xi Jinping, we can also point to the Chinese Communist Party being very aware of how corruption or the perception of corruption or the government's unwillingness to tackle corruption can play out in undermining legitimacy. And that's certainly one of the underlying reasons why the party and the government of China have addressed corruption amongst hundreds of thousands of government officials, very many at the regional and local level of China. And it's also interesting, I've mentioned before, that many of those government officials come from factions that rival President Xi's political factions and his allies. And so this has been a way for a government to use corruption and trying to prosecute corruption to try to build legitimacy, but also to kind of, in some cases, eliminate or diminish political dissent from rivals. We also see in the United Kingdom challenges with political legitimacy related to Brexit. So you don't have to know Brexit. I get a lot of questions on Twitter. Do I have to know about the EU? Do I have to know about this current event? And the answer is no, but it's certainly, well, the answer is you should be aware of really big elements that are current events. And certainly Brexit and the UK's role in the European Union is an example of neoliberalism, which we talked about in the first few lessons. But it's also an example of UK's struggle with how to resolve this policy problem. Of course, this was the big policy problem before COVID-19, that you had voters who directly voiced in 2016 that they wanted the United Kingdom to withdraw from the European Union. But then the government really struggled with how were they actually going to carry out on that policy, because it's enormously complicated to pull out of a big trade agreement and supranational organization like the European Union. If you followed that news, clearly it led to the ouster of Prime Minister Theresa May. Boris Johnson was having tremendous difficulty. Even now, the Conservative Party has almost a year to try to tackle this policy issue. And that can undermine legitimacy if a government can't fulfill a policy outcome that it promised. Devolution, on the same topic of the United Kingdom, but devolution, we've mentioned this before, it's delegating powers from the central government to regional governments. And the course description wants us to know that this can either enhance or weaken legitimacy because of the different outcomes that devolution can create. Certainly on the positive side, that devolution can help regions create innovation, kind of that laboratory of ideas. It matches policies with local needs. Now that Scotland has more power to create healthcare policy in Scotland, you can have competition. And we can see that in many governments, when they allow regional governments to tackle a crisis like COVID-19, we start looking at how other municipalities or other states have had success. And so that competition can improve policymaking. It can increase political participation with local and regional elections. It can also make sure that that central government doesn't get too powerful and abuse its power. And very importantly, devolution allows for more authentic representation by different religious and ethnic minorities. But on the negative side, devolution can create this competition or contradictory policies where there's inequities, particularly between how different regions govern. When you allow local government officials to have more power, you can have plenty of inequities. And sometimes we're confronted by that in the daily news. It can also make policymaking much more complicated because you now have to tackle policy at the local level, where local groups can block big policy changes, and it increases competition for resources. And we're certainly seeing that as different states and municipalities try to tackle this problem of trying to get personal protective equipment for medical personnel, not just in the United States, but across the planet. Questions about the integrity of election results across countries can definitely strengthen legitimacy, but if there are questions about those elections and if there's perceived election fraud, it can very much weaken legitimacy as well. Mexico, one of the critical presidential elections that election fraud was quite evident was in 1988, when the PRI party was really blatant about seeming to steal that election. And after that election, there was a bigger push for election reforms in Mexico. And some of those reforms are still in place today, including national voter IDs, an independent election commission, presidential debates. And those reforms are one of the reasons that Mexico has seen multiple elections where the party out of power actually won the election. And you've seen this increased competition that directly results from that weakened legitimacy that occurred in 1988 in Mexico. As I mentioned before, Iran had tremendous protests related to its 2009 presidential election. These protests were also called the Green Revolution, and the government responded in Iran in a very authoritarian manner with a lot of coercion and force, violence towards the leader of those protests. And also the government of Iran used that opportunity to start monitoring the internet in a much more pervasive way to try to eliminate political dissent and monitor political dissent. Somewhat similar in Russia, although Russia probably used less violence in 2011 and 2012, you still had massive protests against election fraud. And those, that legislative election in 2011 and the presidential election of 2012, certainly we know that the government of Russia does monitor dissidents. It harasses dissidents. It can use unfair trials against dissidents. And increasingly, we've seen the Russian government try to essentially shut down parts of the internet or make it difficult for dissidents to publish information that's critical to the government on the internet. And we saw yesterday, there's some examples of using technology now to monitor those with coronavirus, and some accusations that the government is also using this as an opportunity for more surveillance and other invasive measures of monitoring opponents to the governing power. If you have other country-specific examples of political legitimacy, please feel free to tweet those out to our hashtag APCompGov2020. There are numerous specifically related to COVID-19. And we do have practice questions every day. We have a few multiple choice, even though multiple choice will not be on this revised exam. And then I have one big FRQ I'd like to get to at the end of today's lesson. So which term refers to people's beliefs in the right of a government to rule? And hopefully you know that today that is political legitimacy. And question number 2, on the topic of political legitimacy, what is the importance of a government's political legitimacy? I'm going to give you time to read through those answers. And we have 4 potential choices, but the answer is A, political legitimacy can provide a government more authority to accomplish policy goals. Our final multiple choice question, 2 more multiple choice question, which of the following is an accurate pairing of countries with the description of challenges to political legitimacy in those countries. So let's see how you were paying attention as I went through the country examples. So we have the United Kingdom and Nigeria. Which of those is an accurate pairing of challenges to political legitimacy in those countries? And hopefully you get to the answer of C, that the United Kingdom's inability to implement the withdrawal from the European Union as directed, it's taken quite a while in the United Kingdom, and Nigeria's persistent violence related to an Islamist separatist movement, specifically Boko Haram. Let's do a similar question, but with Russia and Mexico. Which of the following is an accurate pairing of countries with the description of challenges to political legitimacy in Russia and Mexico? I'll give you a little bit of time. And hopefully you came up with D, that in Russia we saw mass protests against perceived electoral fraud. And specific to Mexico, we see the unpunished violence by criminal drug organizations as a challenge to political legitimacy in Mexico. One final question, multiple choice. Which of the following is an accurate comparison of opportunities and obstacles related to devolution? So opportunities and obstacles. Hopefully, as you read through that list, you see that the answer is letter D, that an opportunity of devolution is improving policies through competition, while an obstacle from devolution is increasing competition for resources that can result from empowering regional and local governments. All right, let's get into an FRQ. I put a lot of time into the data. I want to practice another data question with you, and I wrote up a data question. I'm going to probably use this data on a couple different occasions. In fact, before I get into the question, I want to show you the data. One of the beauties of comparative government, and your teacher is one of the stresses of teachers of comparative government, and I've taught this class for 20 plus years. One of the challenges is keeping up with all of the changes in all of our core countries. And every teacher has a country that they have really struggled to keep up with all the changes. Mine is Russia, and trying to keep up with all of the changes that we've seen to the election system in the Duma, with the term limit changes. And now we suspect that there will be major overhauls of the Russian constitution. Well, now we're also finding out that we know that data changes too, and not just the scores, but also how our different organizations report on data. So as I was researching for today's presentation, I wanted to show you that, let's see, I'm going to go into the internet and let's look at how Freedom House reports on this data. So Freedom House used to report on each of the countries and the scores on a 7-point index. And I did not know that they changed their scoring for 2020, where now we have a total score. Let's go to China, for instance. So China is, we know that China is not free. I've reported a score similar to China, but now they have, instead of a 7-point scale that I've shown you previously, the 2020 Freedom House scores for both political rights and civil liberties is now scored on a scale. So I'm going to show you that. We're also going to look at the corruption perception index. So I want to show you that source from transparency.org. And you can see that data on a map of the world, and also the fragile states index, which measures political stability. Again, it's a map of the world on political stability. So I wanted to show you that data as I get into this table. So some of these scores might look a little bit different from data that I've shown you before. But comparative is always bringing us changes, which keeps us on our toes. So lots of data from the 6 different countries. We're looking at political rights in Freedom House. We're looking at civil liberties from Freedom House. We're looking at corruption perception from Transparency International, and we're looking at the Fragile State Index score. Now, just to make this is why I like this table, because it can be confusing. And so you got to take a moment to take it all in. You also have to read. So we have our titles, we have our countries, we also have our scores and the sources. So Freedom House, political rights, that's scored on a scale of 0 to 40. 0 is more authoritarian. So you can see China here, -1, holy smokes. And 40 is more democratic. So United Kingdom up here at 39. We have civil liberties scored as on a scale of 0 to 60. 0 is authoritarian. Again, Iran and China, and the protection of civil liberties, very low. And 60 is more democratic. So the United Kingdom, with a score of 55, is relatively high. But then we get the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. This is scored on a scale of 0 to 100. 0 is more corrupt. So you can see we have a number of countries in the 20s that are perceived to be as more corrupt. And 100 is less corrupt. So you'd rather actually have a higher score in the Corruption Perception Index, but then you don't want the higher score on the Fragile State Index, because on the Fragile State Index put out by the Fund for Peace, you have a scale of 0 to 120. 0 is the most stable, and 120 is the least stable. So a higher score here that Nigeria has and Iran has, a higher score indicates more fragility and less political stability. So you got to read, particularly when there's asterisks directing you to a scale. So you have to know what those numbers indicate. So that's my little lesson on data literacy. And after you get through your data literacy, let's get into the question. So, in fact, it might help before you get into the question on this frantic test day on May 22nd, whenever you get the data, it would probably help for you to read. You don't have to necessarily look at the scores, but you want to read what the data is being presented, okay? And that's one of my tips, is to read the titles, read any of the footnotes, because those footnotes can be quite important. And what am I looking at? What is being measured? And then you can get into the numbers. So I'm going to make this just 4 questions today. Using the data in the table, identify the country that is perceived as the most corrupt with the least protection of civil liberties of the countries listed. Use the data in the table, describe the difference between the perception of corruption in a state with less political stability as compared to perception in a state with more political stability. So again, I'm describing there. I'm identifying in letter A, and then I'm describing in letter B. And then C and D is I have to explain. Pick a listed country and explain how that country could use data from the table to try to build its political legitimacy. All right, so here we have the word of the day, political legitimacy. In letter D, pick a listed country and explain how. So that's my directive. Explain how data from the table could be used as evidence of an obstacle to sustaining political legitimacy in that country. So I'm going to try to do those 4 directives for you right here. When you're asked to identify, that is all you have to do. You just have to have the name of the country. In the case of the country that is perceived as the most corrupt with the least protection of civil liberties of the countries listed, the correct answer to this is Iran, but just don't write the country name Iran and expect to get credit for here. We want a complete answer. And the complete answer is we need the name Iran, but we also need you to connect that to data on the table. You have to use data on the table. So you have to be complete. So that's where I use a complete sentence. According to the data on the table, Iran is the country listed with the least protection of civil liberties. And then I use its score from the Freedom House table. It is perceived as the most corrupt. And again, I use the score on the table. So I don't think that's terribly complicated. However, I know a lot of my students like to be very brief when they answer. I'm guessing that some of you like to be brief in your answers. And this is where a brief answer is not going to get what should be an easy point if you have a question like this. So make sure you use the data on the table. Letter B, using the data on the table, describe the difference between the perception of a corruption in a state with less political stability as compared to perception of a state with more political stability. Okay, so we're looking at, this is tricky because we're looking at both stability, and we're supposed to be taking a country with less political stability, which in this case is Iran or Nigeria would certainly satisfy that. And we're comparing it with a state with more political stability. So United Kingdom can be an example of that. But we're also looking at how citizens perceive corruption. So we got to focus on how Nigerians perceive corruption in Nigeria, how Iranians perceive corruption in Iran. Pick either one of those two countries, and we should compare it to a country, again, that's more stable in what the perception of corruption is there. This can be hard, so you get a lot of different thoughts going through your head, so you just need to make sure you keep it clear. I think a really, really big tip on this that I see when I've scored my own students' exams and when I've scored AP exams for College Board, and that is avoid pronouns. Pronouns can be a killer when a student's trying to write about a lot of different thoughts and specifically different countries. So don't say it when you mean Nigeria. Don't say them if you mean United Kingdom. Be really, really clear with your countries and really avoid pronouns like it, they, them, things, stuff. Those pronouns or vague nouns can be killers on points. So be really specific. According to the data, Nigeria is a fragile state. And here I use the data, got to use the data. Whoops. Nigeria is a fragile state with a score of 98, indicating it's less politically stable, with a perception that it is quite corrupt with a score of 26 from the Transparency International. This is significantly lower from the corruption perception score of 77 for the United Kingdom, that is the most stable country listed, with a stability score of 36.7 from the Fund for Peace. So I put a lot of data in this. I wanted to make sure I was complete. All I'm being asked to do is describe, so I don't have to say why this is. I don't have to say how this came to be. That's not what the question's directing me to do. I have to simply describe the difference between the two. So I've taken Nigeria and described the difference with a more stable government listed, and that's the United Kingdom, and make sure you accurately describe the data used. Again, it can take some time. Avoid the pronouns, make sure you're complete, be really complete, and don't worry about reusing the question, the vocabulary. In many cases, that can help you come up with a clearer answer. So C and D get more complicated because C and D are asking us to explain how. That's what the direction is, to explain how. So there's more expected of a student when they're trying to explain how or explain why. So pick a country listed and explain how that country could use data from the table to try to build its political legitimacy. And you can see my answer here. Despite its score of 98, indicating a significant political instability, Nigeria's government could try to build its political legitimacy by making the case. Here's my explain how. I'm saying, how does this happen? How it does a much better job of protecting civil liberties and political rights than more stable governments. I want to be complete. Now I talk about a country that's more stable. China on the chart is more stable. China scored at a more stable government, but Nigeria scores 23 points higher than China in political rights and 14 points higher in the protection of civil liberties. You know, just in case I didn't say it, I want to put another sentence in there to show that I know what I'm talking about. Publicizing these scores could help Nigeria make the argument that these higher Freedom House scores means that citizens should have stronger belief that Nigeria's government has the right to rule, which is political legitimacy. I want the reader to know that I know what political legitimacy is, that I can use data to explain how that data can be interpreted to build political legitimacy. You know, I happen to contrast it with China. I had the data that was available for me to do that. If you feel comfortable making that contrast, you can make that contrast. But I wanted to give a full explanation how. So by making the case, these scores mean that citizens have stronger beliefs, which is political legitimacy. The final point from this sample FRQ that I wrote, pick a listed country, explain how the data can be used as an evidence of an obstacle to sustaining political legitimacy in that country. I happen to pick China. China's poor score of a -1 from Freedom House on its protection of political rights could be used as evidence as being an obstacle to sustaining political legitimacy because, remember, I was asked to explain how. That was a directive. Want to get a because in there because of the perception that China is insecure about granting its citizens more political rights. This can be an obstacle to China sustaining political legitimacy because this score could indicate that China seems unwilling to allow its citizens to have political rights to shape government policies that can infringe on citizens' belief that China's government has the right to rule. There's where I put that definition of political legitimacy in there. And just to make sure everyone knows, I know what political legitimacy is, I connect that definition to political legitimacy. So that is how you can use data to connect to our term of the day, political legitimacy and sources of legitimacy. We're going to see later that this is connected to tomorrow's topic of political stability, also in 2.7. If you have more country-specific examples of political legitimacy, please use that hashtag. Also, if you have external influences on political stability, that's the topic tomorrow, 1.10, political stability. Tweet those examples out to the hashtag. And finally, please help me build an argument essay tomorrow. I'd like to write an argument essay and answer that for you tomorrow about political stability. So give me something that I can make an argument about. And also make sure when we're developing argument essays, we like to put in 3 key concepts that need to be connected to the argument. That's what College Board expects you to be able to do. So if you have a potential argument, maybe a choice that you want students to argue, I'll make the argument. I'll show you an example of that. And also, what are 3 key words? Hopefully they're words we've covered before. Maybe it's a word you know that we have to tackle down the road. Maybe it's political legitimacy. Political legitimacy would be a great word to try to connect in with political stability. You can show off if you know political legitimacy. Tweet me examples of a potential argument essay that I'll tackle tomorrow at hashtag APCompGov2020. Also tonight on PBS across the country, Normal West, Mr. Klokenga of Normal West tweeted out to me to make sure to advertise China Undercover about China's treatment of Uyghurs tonight on PBS Frontline, either on TV or streaming. That starts tonight. If you have technology concerns, reach out to College Board. Tomorrow, we're looking at political stability. Thank you very much. I hope you have a pleasant evening. Be well.